I'm going to try some extrapolating on the go. I'm reading the book Neurotribes by Steven Silberman, and it's really fascinating. And a sentence says, many autistic adults are not exercising the strengths of their atypical minds at companies like Apple and Google. Instead, a disproportionate number are underemployed and struggling to get by on disability payments. And to me, this reminds me of how through a process of map consciousness or trans consciousness or omnipolar consciousness that is usually labeled something like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, our minds become atypical minds that have strengths and gifts that are not recognized and not utilized. And so many of us end up on disability. I feel like kids can be born on the spectrum and have atypical minds, or we can actually have some kind of crisis where our ego structure breaks down and then we acquire an atypical mind. And ideally, we would be able to find the gifts and where that fits instead of just trying to recover. So to me, behavioral intervention in something like autism is the same equivalent as recovery in something like bipolar. Trying to force the brain to be like everybody else and missing diverting energy into figuring out what it is the brain is wanting to do differently. And that was on page 15. And another part on page 15, it says that by sharing the stories of their lives, they discovered that many of the challenges they face are not symptoms of their autism, but hardships imposed by a society that refuses to make basic accommodations for people with cognitive disabilities as it does for people with physical disabilities such as blindness and deafness. I would say the jury's still out on whether it's a cognitive deficiency. It's probably reallocation of cognition and its resources, but I don't know if it's a deficiency. And are we all supposed to be thinking and seeing and experiencing life in exactly the same way? And none of us are, but with the ego, whoever operates based on that can pretend that we're all operating in the same way by manifesting outward behaviors that are similar and meanwhile boiling inside. So if the normal way of thinking is cognitively effective, I don't think that's true. I would say even a so-called normal brain is cognitively deficient in many ways. And he also mentions that newly diagnosed adults were engaged in a very different conversation about the difficulties of navigating and surviving in a world not built for them. And I've talked about that with myself, about how after going through a crisis and having the ego structure suspended, the world is no longer built for me or whoever. It's built for that ego structure. So if that isn't intact, then naturally the world is going to be a very difficult place because it is built for that structure which is competitive and driven for success and based on so many things. So this is a real-time extrapolation. Usually I make notes and write them down and come back to them later, but I'm thinking that that process isn't good to do anymore because it just leads to a huge pileup of notes, and I have 100 pages of typed notes that I don't know if I'll ever get to, and it doesn't really matter. If anyone ever wants access to that, let me know. I don't know if it's interesting, but as I read this book, real-time extrapolation is a complement to what someone else has written that very cleanly extrapolates to my own context and what I've created. And this book, the pages are full of so much of that. It's almost like being able to write a book based on someone else's book, but just changing the words, and it's the same book. For example, on page 16, it says, Autism, dyslexia, ADHD should be regarded as naturally occurring cognitive variations with distinctive strengths that have contributed to the evolution of technology and culture rather than mere checklists of deficits and dysfunctions. So one could change that sentence to be bipolar consciousness or omnipolar consciousness, trans consciousness, map consciousness should be regarded as naturally occurring cognitive variations that can happen partway through life with distinctive strengths that have contributed to the evolution of XYZ. We probably don't even know what that contribution is because it's just seen as a pathology and we're told to believe it to be a pathology, and then we no longer continue to think for ourselves and discover for ourselves and think differently for ourselves. On the inside cover of this book on neurodiversity and autism, it says, "Thinking smarter about people who think differently." And why should we not be allowed to change the way we think or the way we see the world partway through our life? Why should that be seen as some kind of pathology? So I like how this book is not saying that autism is a pathology, and I extrapolate that to my own context. And then the next sentence, the idea of neurodiversity has inspired the creation of a rapidly growing civil rights movement based on the simple idea that the most astute interpreters of autistic behavior are autistic people themselves rather than their parents or doctors. And I would say that's the same for bipolar, what's called bipolar disorder. Nobody really asks us what's happening. They just interpret our behaviors and say it's a pathology. They don't ask us to interpret our own behaviors. They just tell us to report, and there's no dialogue around it. So that's why I engage in dialogue with myself. And then it goes on to talk about a story about someone named Amelia Baggs who posted a video on YouTube called In My Language. And it talks about how she shares how she can type, but she doesn't really speak, and then she's doing a bunch of stuff at the same time, like bobbing a slinky and rubbing her face in a book or something. And they say that a clinician would say she's exhibiting self-stimulating behavior, one of the classic signs of autism. But in the second part of a video called A Translation, Baggs makes it clear that she's not sharing these intimate glimpses of her life as a plea for pity. Her intent is more subversive, celebrating the joy of her existence on her own terms. She says, "My language is not about designing words or even visual symbols for people to interpret." She explains, "It's about being in constant conversation with every aspect of my environment, reacting physically to all parts of my surroundings. Far from being purposeless, the way that I move is an ongoing response to what is around me." And that really resonates with me because I feel like when in map consciousness, it's similar. One is in this profound connection with the moment and is reacting with what is around one at the time. And that's why it's so random and supposedly chaotic and synchronous, because we're just really synchronizing with what our eyes are seeing. And I've talked a lot about this, how it's about perception and action. And that doesn't really go with the way the ego is designed to ruminate about things, think about things, be thinking about something else when doing this other thing, not really in touch with what one is doing. So I feel like this process of autism and the process of transconsciousness, or that whole structure breaking down, has a similar something in that children who develop autism, or however it works, they never have the chance to develop to early adulthood and learn all the gestures and behaviors of so-called normality. And I'm not saying that's what normal is. I'm just saying, for example, and then that whole structure breaks down, but one still has access to be able to move in those ways, but one still becomes hypersensitive to a lot of things. So it's the same type of consciousness, but children with autism never experienced supposed normal consciousness. They weren't able to be conditioned to behave in all the supposedly normal ways. But it's the same type of consciousness where one is just responding to what's around one. And I thought about this the other day. I was thinking about, what would that kind of life look like? What would it look like if we had a blank slate in our mind and we still could move in all the ways that we learned to, but then we no longer had all that conditioning of assumptions and all that content in our mind? If we were just dropped somewhere, what would our life unfold as? It would be completely different because we don't have those programs operating, all those assumptions. And I wonder if I could design my life in that way. I'm not sure. It's possible. But I see a lot of the commonalities with autism. It's seemingly just not having this ego structure of the unwritten rules of society, like Temple Grandin might say, or a term that I learned recently at this course called the invisible curriculum, that we learn in school around the social order, and a lot of school is about that and not really about this learning and learning how to learn. So it seems like there's a learning without the invisible curriculum, and the invisible curriculum isn't real, and I don't really want to go into it right now, but it's a contrivance. So that's partly what disappears in somebody who goes through a trans-conscious or map-conscious experience, is that invisible curriculum is no longer there, and one is able to operate freely based on one's own perception and action. Unfortunately, children with autism didn't have those gestures developed to be able to move around freely in society without whatever, but this is really hard to describe. What I'm trying to point to is that it seems like we as human beings might need to consider learning how to operate without this structure, because children are being born without it and not able to acquire it, and it's not even a real structure. It's a cage in a way, and we all want to be released from that cage. So is there a way to learn how to operate without the cage? Because any one of us could be released from it at any time, or have a child born that isn't able to develop that cage of premeditating everything that they do. And in that way, and I hope that my self-dialogue with myself is a way to celebrate my own existence on my own terms. And I like how this book is pointing to how they're spending so much effort looking for the cause and trying to fix it, and behavioral intervention. They're doing the same thing in so-called mental illness, looking for interventions and ways to fix the problem, and they're not seeing that there are gifts. And part of me talking so much to myself is just acknowledging the gift of having access to so many words and language creation, and I'm wanting to get away from that because I'm seeing that words are not action so much, but it seems like if we're less able to operate in the world of words, we're less able to take action because words are scary. And look at how sensitive a lot of autistic children are, and how sensitive a lot of people with mental illness labels, supposed mental illness, become. Yet we're not designing a world that is sensitive to those sensitivities, because the majority in this supposed normal consciousness don't sense those sensitivities that are causing a buildup of allostatic load. But everyone else's allostatic load is building up at the same time, and they could crack at any time, meaning their ego structure could break, and that's the structure that keeps all of these aspects of life seemingly not important in terms of overstimulation and things. And the gentleman who wrote this book attended something called Awe Treat, which is a retreat organized for autistic people by autistic people. And they talk about how in a social environment carefully constructed to eliminate sources of sensory overload and anxiety while maximizing opportunities for people on the spectrum to simply relax, enjoy being themselves, and make connections with one another. It'd be cool to make a retreat for bipolar people and eliminate those aspects that we are sensitive to as a neurotribe and maximize creativity. And I talked about, and other aspects too, but I've talked about how if I ever did create something like a respite, I wouldn't want to just create a respite for decompressing from all those sensitivities, but also create a creative space to augment the gifts. Because if we're always just going out into the world and then building up our stress and then breaking down and then doing that cycle over and over, it's again just trying to intervene and recover and not actually discover. So if I ever created some kind of something, it would be a discovery learning community to learn and discover for oneself what one's own unique capacities are. Because each person that goes through this is a unique piece of the puzzle, and maybe I can talk to myself for hours on video and whatever, but other people have other gifts. And if we got together, we might really be able to create something. And he says that after just 4 days in autism land, the mainstream world seemed like a constant sensory assault. And it is. And I feel that too. I'm struggling with the sound of the TV being on and the buzzing of a mini fridge. So certain sounds just really bother me, so I need quiet. I'm at a really quiet park, and I'm probably one of the only ones here. I feel like I want to email this guy and ask him to consider the neurodiversity of people who are labeled with mental illnesses. If we can be two and developing normally and speaking and then all of a sudden lose our speech and be on the autism spectrum, why can't it be considered that we can be 19 and developing normally and then end up on some kind of spectrum other than what is so-called normal? Why can't we imagine that we might become neurodiverse after becoming neurologically perversed into being what we aren't, being so similar to everybody else? And this book has made the point that kids are also different when they're on the autism spectrum. Well, maybe we're all really different, but we've just been conditioned to be so similar. This feels kind of like information overload already. It just really hurts that my tribe of people are called cognitively deficient and defective and all those things, instead of thinking in terms of neurodiversity and new gifts, and that our brain can become almost a blank slate at any time and we can relearn things. But when we're so busy trying to fix things and recover and focus on pathology and intervention, we're not allowing something new to flower. I read a tweet yesterday about how there's going to be a conference on cognitive remediation. And I don't know so much about that term, but it's something to do with how people with labels of schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders tend to have cognitive declines over time as a result of their illness. And what pisses me off royally about that is they never say anything like, these people have been on these mind-numbing, brain-altering drugs for however many years, and they never say, well, that's what causes part of the supposed cognitive decline. They just say it's cognitive decline as a result of their illness. And I don't believe that for 1 second, because I've experienced 5 episodes of psychosis, yet I don't feel any kind of cognitive decline. And I was on medications for 6 years, and I was never on antipsychotics long term, only for short periods of time when I had the psychosis happening, or whatever it was. I'll just call it psychosis for now. And then once that was over, I was no longer on those antipsychotics. I feel like it's not good to be on antipsychotics daily, but they generally do that. If people have a psychosis, then they are given daily antipsychotics indefinitely instead of just given antipsychotics when there's actual psychosis-like things happening. And then the rest of the time allowing the brain to recover from being on those drugs. There's studies out there that show that being on those drugs for any more than 2 weeks is detrimental, and there's studies that the long-term outcomes are better for people who don't take that kind of stuff on a daily basis. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there like that. Yet there's this big thing around cognitive remediation, how to get some of that cognitive capacity back. It's like taking it away by drugging someone and then saying, we're going to put you through this little computerized course so you can get some of your cognition back. I'm tempted to go just because I almost want to be a spy. I want to hear what they're saying about us, because I don't have a label of schizophrenia, but it says schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. And I have bipolar disorder, supposedly, a psychotic disorder. I've experienced psychosis 5 times, and I don't agree that that's what causes the cognitive decline. I think it's the over-medication, being on extra heavy, too much medication for long periods of time that messes up the brain. And it would mess up the brain too, because it definitely limits our epi-gestures. Our movements are possibilities in life, and that's what keeps the brain growing and working and learning, not sitting watching TV, drugged out, smoking cigarettes and drinking Coke. So there's just so much to say on that, and I don't even know where to begin. But yeah, maybe just going undercover and investigating what are they saying, because there'll be scientist type people and clinicians trying to sell us our cognition back to us after taking it away with all the drugs. So I'm kind of tired of being referred to as cognitively defective or deficient. And I'm tired of people being pointed to as that when anyone's brain would shrivel up if they were put on toxic mind-numbing meds for years upon end, which limits their ability to go out in the world and experience life. The brain is a reflection of our experience in daily life. So if we're not doing that much, it's going to shrivel up. Give any so-called normal person those same drugs. Where's their trials on normal people taking these drugs long term to see if they have the same cognitive deficits, supposedly, as somebody who's taking the drug long term with a label? So how have they determined that it's not the drug itself that's shrinking up and destroying the brain? It's very toxic. So if they put someone who doesn't have something called schizophrenia on those drugs for 10 years, and then check back and see how well they're doing cognitively, I don't think that they're going to be doing very well. So that's part of my point, and that pisses me off that they never point to that, because they don't have a big group of people with a label of schizophrenia who aren't taking any drugs. They're all drugged up, and then it's seen as that's worsening of their illness. And that's what really pissed me off about my hospital stay in April 2016, is they put me on something that made me so much worse. And had I been on that for a long period of time, I wouldn't be able to string two words together. So to go with that, I actually tried my Muse headband this morning, and I took some screenshots, and so I will add those in and do some voice over commentary, because I can't really remember what they are now until I edit the video. And it was really interesting. I did the little 5-minute beginner meditation, and I earned 4 birds, and I got a lot of good points. I don't know what most people's is like on the first go, and I'm going to try that on some of the people that I know to see what theirs is like, to kind of compare. Because apparently I have this really defective bipolar brain. And also I bought the app called Muse Monitor, and it gives access to the raw data, which is really cool. And I don't really exactly know what I'm looking at, but it seems cool to begin with. And I do need Microsoft Excel to be able to graph some of it, I think. So I might try that at some point. So this is just the initial looking at it, trying it, and seeing what the app is like, but I have no real knowledge about what it's trying to tell me, or I don't know this language of the brain. But it was really interesting to have my brain see what my brain is doing according to this device. And one thing I'll be interested in seeing is there's one screen on the Muse Monitor app that shows the different brain waves: alpha, theta, delta, beta, gamma. And it shows that I have some gamma waves going on. And I really don't know if that means anything, because I haven't compared. So if I put that headband on somebody else and see that they have no gamma waves, then maybe the fact that it shows that there's some gamma waves there for me means something. I don't know. Because I've talked a little bit before about how I feel like the insights might come from a gamma wave state. And I listened to somebody's podcast on the Neuroscience Summit. It was that guy from The Law of Attraction, The Secret. I can't remember his name right now, but he was talking about the different brain waves, and then he talked about gamma, and then said, but I'm not going to talk about those, when it seemed like those were the cool ones, because it's about unity consciousness and blah blah blah. So I feel like transconscious people might have more brain space devoted to unity consciousness and less devoted to the ego. So the ego is more about beta waves, I think. I'm just making this stuff up for now. Maybe at some point I'll actually look into it more. And then gamma is more about unity and blah blah blah. So I feel like my brain might be tapped into that, and I don't know, but now I finally have this cool device that might actually be able to show that my brain isn't actually doing crappy abnormal things, it's actually doing some cool things. And I can't really prove that yet or anything, because I don't have anything to compare it to, and I don't really know what the data is talking about, but I very soon might. So it's kind of exciting. And it's exciting too, because next time I go into a hyper insightful state, I'll be able to put that thing on my head and see what's going on in my brain. Or even if I do have some stress or something, and then compare it to other brains, and yeah, we'll see. And I do feel like all that time I practiced the power of now, it was able to get me into a really mindful state, and perhaps some of my little meditation graphs might show that. So this is going to be a big part of my dialogue with myself, because my brain can actually see what it's doing, and then I have to learn the language of that to understand that more. But that is really interesting to me. This could actually be something really big. Maybe I'll learn that this type of headband is a way that people like me can really help see what's going on in their brain. It's really exciting. And I don't know if I talked about it, but some tools I'm adding to my arsenal. I bought a extra battery charge pack for my iPhone because the battery keeps dying really quickly. I think it's because I'm in a rural area and its attempts to connect to the towers takes more juice, as well as it's hot out, so it's draining the battery faster. Plus it's getting old. I have worked this phone really, really, really hard this last year. I have made videos and edited them and uploaded them and saved them and all these things. This has been a really good phone, and I was actually looking at the rumors for the next release of the iPhone, and it might not be until October, so I might have 3 more months with this phone. So I need that extra battery, and that will give me some more mobility and the ability to just be outside and not have to go back somewhere to charge my phone. And that's part of omnipolar lifestyle design, being able to be in touch with the moment and move with the moment, not having to be at home waiting for a plug. And I'm also going to think of a business name. I'm just going to do it. I'm not going to ask permission of anyone or advice. I'm just going to learn along the way, even if it's really, really slow. Until next time, see willing possibilities. And yesterday, I also took a lot of steps. I went for a really, really long walk in a park, and it just felt really good. I felt really energized, and the day felt like a really long and rich day. So at some point, I'll get my butt up and get walking in this park. So much to do. So fascinating.